There's something else that probably ought to be brought up about Platonic idealism and aesthetics here as well. Plato isn't exactly anti-art. You can get that feeling from reading him, and certainly Beardsley lifts up that aspect of it when he's giving his summary of it. But he's not exactly anti-aesthetic entirely. In fact, it's kind of strange that he is as much as he is, given, if you ever get a chance to read him directly, how poetic and metaphorical he is in so much of his writing and his thinking. But what he is someone who is, shall we say, a stickler for beauty. For Plato, beauty is one of the highest of ideas. And I mean ideas in the way that Plato has talked about ideas. And, these ideals, right? In this respect, beauty is something that for Plato is almost in the way that we apprehend it in the world, somewhat undefinable. It's something that we recognize in very base ways, certainly. We recognize it in a base way with regard to physical beauty. We recognize it in regard to the passions. We recognize it in regard to the general movement of our emotions. And we also recognize for Plato, and this is something that's lifted up by later Platonic thinkers even more so, the way in which, as we come to have a deeper understanding of what the nature of beauty and indeed of truth is, so it is that our sense of beauty becomes less and less wrapped up in our immediate senses. It's not that we don't recognize beauty in the physical, so much as in recognizing the truth of beauty, we recognize how little the physical seems to have to do with it, precisely because it's changing, precisely because it doesn't disclose anything about itself. Because of this, Plato is distrustful of art because he thinks it's misleading. He was afraid that people would become trapped to some extent, in their own ignorance, in their own misunderstanding of the nature of beauty through art. And because of that, he wanted art to be censored. Not prohibited necessarily, but controlled, led, almost something that could prepare people, organize people, reach them where they were at, and for their better interests in spite of themselves. In this regard, for Plato, beauty is something that is very much a deep source of power and a deep opportunity when used right. And art is almost an educational medium more than anything else. It's a way to help us improve ourselves, a way for us to come to recognize the deeper truths and the deeper possibilities of that which allows us to be what we are, these ideals, right? This Platonic idealism, and indeed what allows the world to be what it is. For Plato, art can, when done well, and more importantly managed well, reveal a great deal about the way the world is to us. But again, the problem with art for Plato is that it is something that is not a master of itself. I remember, I'll tell you a little story that I'm reminded of right now with this. There's a famous writer, won the Nobel Prize a number of years ago, named J.M. Cotzee. He's a South African writer. And I remember once I was listening to him give a public lecture, which was kind of a special deal because he doesn't like to speak in public very much. He's a rather private person, I guess. Anyway, he was speaking, and he was asked by somebody in the audience about a character that he had written about in one of the books, and whether this character really believed this, or really believed this, or was really trying to do this. It became a rather elaborate question that this person was asking. And Cotzee stopped him in the middle of the question, and he said, listen, I'm the wrong person to ask about this. You might want to ask a literary critic or a professor of literature or somebody like that who's studied this stuff and thought through this stuff. He said, but I'm just a writer. And he said, you know, I don't write because I think I know the answers. I write to explore the answers and produce something for it. I thought that was a really interesting thing to say, but one of the things that comes to my mind with it, and the reason I'm bringing it up here with this little discussion about Plato and censorship and art, is because I thought that there was more than a little bit of Platonism in that. Because Cotzee seemed to recognize a point that Plato was trying to make, which is just because someone knows how to do something doesn't mean that they understand it. And quite often, it's an indication that they don't understand it. That whatever truth and insight is there needs to be managed by people who are in a better position to understand it than the artists themselves. Platonic point, and I thought it was an interesting thing. So, anyway, the gist of this is that there very much is a deep sense of beauty that runs through art. That art is beautiful, and beauty is important, and art is important insofar as it brings beauty into the world. But it has to be managed rightly. It has to be directed for educational purposes, for self-improvement, broad educational purposes. And this, from Plato's point of view, is not something you leave to the artist, especially in his mind to the poets.